Asia's Promise or Continuing Problem. And our speaker is Mr. Edward E. Matthews, who is a former United States ambassador to Indonesia and who was instrumental in the founding of the United States-Indonesia Society, which is designed to promote understanding of Indonesia and a greater appreciation of American interests in Indonesia. But before we begin, let me thank the Northrop Grumman Electronic System and Sensors International and Lloyd Carpenter, its chairman, for sponsoring this evening's reception. All of you are well aware of the fact that Indonesia really is not talked about as much as it probably should be, being the fourth most populous nation on the globe and the largest Muslim majority country, and up until a few years ago, one of the outstanding Asian tiger economic examples, and always a nation made more interesting and more complicated by its enormous diversity, related, of course, to its being composed of innumerable islands stretching across a length of the globe equivalent to the width of the United States. It's a fascinating and important country, and we're extraordinarily pleased that our guest speaker tonight, as I say, was a founding member of an organization which is dedicated to the specific purpose of increasing awareness of the importance of that nation and its interesting aspects. Mr. Matthews Mr. Masters, thank you, was a Foreign Service officer for 30 years. He was posted predominantly in Asia. He served in India and Pakistan, was our Deputy Chief of Mission in Thailand. He was ambassador to Bangladesh and, of course, ambassador to Indonesia as well. His public service career continued after his retirement after 30 years in the Foreign Service. He has taught at both the Fletcher School and is now teaching at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies in Washington. He was in private business with one of the Fortune 500 companies for a number of years after being in the Foreign Service, a company predominantly very powerful in international markets. And he became president and CEO of the Public Policy Association. I don't have the exact correct title for that, but that is an organization dedicated to bringing together American leaders of business, labor, and academia to discuss global problems. And then, as I said, in 1994, was instrumental in establishing the U.S.-Indonesia Society, of which he is presently the vice president. The topic, I think, is of extraordinary interest, and our speaker is most appropriate. It's my enormous pleasure to present to you Mr. Edward E. Masters.
Thank you very much, Dr. Byrd and members of the Council. It's a great pleasure to have a chance to meet with you this evening on this cold, blustery, snowy evening, which I thought this morning, well, my gosh, we'll be lucky if we have half a dozen people, but the weatherman was wrong this time, fortunately. Well, I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with you about Indonesia, which, as Dr. Byrd said, is a large country about which Americans know much less than they should. It's an important country, and it's one that in our own national interests, we need to focus on much more directly and much more thoroughly than we have. Now, obviously, you know that it's important, or you wouldn't be here this evening. But being a former bureaucrat, let me just tick off some of the reasons why in the government we used to say, and in fact the government still does say, that Indonesia is a very important country. First is its size, 210 million people, fourth largest in the world, used to be fifth before the Soviet Union fell apart. A country of 17,508 islands, according to satellite surveys, makes it by far the largest archipelago in the world. Next running would be the Philippines, which has only 7,000 islands. Now, of those 17,508 in Indonesia, they're not all inhabited. Some of them are small coral outcroppings, but about 6,000 are inhabited. And among those numerous islands are all or part of three of the largest islands in the world. New Guinea, which is second only to Greenland, Borneo, which is number 3, and Sumatra, which is entirely within Indonesia. So the size and the geographic complexity alone make Indonesia extremely important. The location also gives it strong importance. And again, the cliche is it's at the conjunction of mainland Asia and Australia and the joining of the Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean. That's a Freudian slip. Sukarno used to call it the Indonesian Ocean, but it's still, I think, on most maps is called the Indian Ocean. And Indonesia, by its location, controls these very important sea routes linking these two great oceans. It controls 4 major straits through which about 40% of all the world's shipping pass. Now, I assume that some of these ships that go out of here probably end up one way or another in one or more of those straits. 80% of Japan's oil goes through Indonesia. If that access were blocked, Japan would be in deep trouble, and so would we because of our very close relationship with Japan. Indonesia, as a third point, has vast resources, human resources, but also natural resources. It has oil. It's the world's largest producer of liquefied natural gas. It has the world's largest gold mine, which has been developed and is producing now by Freeport, a New Orleans company. It has bauxite, tin, coal, nickel, etc., almost unlimited resources. It's also important because of its strong history of constructive international engagement. Indonesia was one of the founding members, in fact, one of the prime members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. Without Indonesia's strong involvement, there would have been no ASEAN, and without Indonesia's continued support, ASEAN would obviously wither, because Indonesia has half the population and much more than half the resources of all of Southeast Asia. Indonesia's also been very active and very constructive in other international forums. The Organization of Islamic Countries, OPEC, it's the only Asian member of OPEC. APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum, and so forth. It also has participated in almost every UN peacekeeping force anywhere in the world. And it's played a very important role in bringing peace in Cambodia in 1991 and in reducing the tensions in the Philippines between the Moro National Liberation Group and the Philippine government. So for all of these reasons, Indonesia is extremely important. But there are 2 more reasons that I think have come in more recently. And one of these is because Indonesia is critical to the stability of Southeast Asia. Now, if you buy the theory that many people support, and that I must say I attach some importance to, that China in the years ahead is going to become more active, more aggressive, more assertive, China is not likely to push in Northeast Asia, because in Northeast Asia you have Japan, which has a strong alliance with the United States. You have Korea, where we have a very strong commitment to South Korea. Taiwan, of course, is under our security umbrella. So it would be much more likely that if China becomes more aggressive in the international arena, it would push in Southeast Asia. For that reason, it is extremely important that Southeast Asia be stable, and as I said, without a stable, developing, progressive Indonesia, Southeast Asia will not meet that requirement. The second, more recent reason why Indonesia is important is because it is committed to a long and possibly tortuous road toward democracy. And this is important for the reason that Dr. Bird mentioned. This country is by far the largest Muslim country in the world. 87% of its 210 million people are Muslim. That means there are more Muslims in Indonesia than in all the Arab countries combined. Now, if Indonesia can make democracy work, it will give the lie to the cliche that democracy and Islam are incompatible. It will perhaps give some lessons to countries in the Middle East that there is another way that they might follow if they accepted, adopted, followed the Indonesian example. So for all of these reasons, this is a very important country, and one, as I say, that we need to focus on much more than we do. Now, as Dr. Bird mentioned, I'm teaching a course at SAIS, and I can't resist a little bit of an academic approach here. Without giving you Indonesia 101, I do want to give you a little historical perspective on the country because I think it helps explain some of the tremendous problems that the country faces right now. Indonesia was unlucky during the colonial era to be colonized by the Dutch. I have always thought that if you had to be colonized in those days, it was much better to be colonized by the British, because the British, although they had their own axes to grind, left three things behind when they voluntarily left their colonies. That was a functioning legal system and a commitment to the rule of law, a functioning educational system, and a cadre of educated people, and of particular importance, a good civil service. Indonesia ended up with none of these after 350 years of Dutch rule. The Dutch used Indonesia strictly for its own benefit to supply the European market, mostly with spices, but also with sugarcane, indigo, other products that were marketed by and through the Netherlands. And as a result, this small country in Northern Europe, and a great country and great people, were able to live a life and have a style of life that far exceeded what otherwise would have been available to them. But the Indonesians did not benefit from that. The basic economic system that they put in place was called the cultivation system. And under this, for many, many years, the Dutch gave a quota to all Indonesian farmers to produce a certain amount of an exportable commodity, sugarcane or whatever. They bought it at a very low fixed price. The farmer did not make out well, but the Dutch merchant, the Dutch shipper, the Dutch financier made out very well indeed. So the result was that when Indonesia became independent, it did not have the basic infrastructure of a modern economy. In fact, very far from it. Also in the educational field, the Dutch did not promote education for the Indonesians. And again, the result was that when Indonesia finally achieved its independence in 1949, a country of 70 million people, the number of college graduates were no more than the number of people in this room. And they were mostly in the fields of engineering and medicine. There were virtually no management specialists, no political scientists, hardly any economists, etc. And that's one of the reasons why the country has been very slow to start modern development. Also on the civil service side, Indonesia was way behind. The Dutch occupied all the good jobs. I've been told that even the postmen in Batavia, now called Jakarta, were Dutch. The Indonesians were not even trusted to deliver the mail. So the result was that when the Dutch left after Indonesia got its independence, and then finally in 1957, when Indonesia threw out those that remained, the clerks became the ministers and the sergeants became the generals. And as you might imagine, that has not been a formula for rapid economic growth. Now, Indonesia declared its war in 1945 after a very brutal 3.5-year occupation by the Japanese, which further built on the authoritarian precedents that the Dutch had laid down for 350 years. They declared their independence August 17, 1945, but the Dutch didn't see it that way. This was a very prosperous colony to have. The Dutch came back in, and there were 4 years of warfare before Indonesia actually did get its independence. The United States, for much of that time, supported the Dutch because of European imperatives and the beginning of the Cold War and so on. Although at the very end of that period, we did lean on the Dutch and say, look, you must give these people their independence. But that was a while in coming. The result of all this was that Indonesians came out of this experience with colonialism, with Japanese occupation, and with a 4-year guerrilla war to achieve their independence, with a very strong, exaggerated sense of nationalism, which they still have, frankly, and which we still see today. They also came out of it, unfortunately, with some anti-Western feeling because of the Dutch being a part of the Western world and because the United States was slow in recognizing their national aspirations, and because of the economic experience with anti-free market feelings. Now, these changed, fortunately, in more recent years, but the heritage is still there. Their first president, Sukarno, didn't help the situation at all. He was a great independence leader. He was a charismatic figure, a rabble-rouser, a terrific speaker. In the 1960s, on my first tour in Jakarta, I used to go to a lot of his speeches, and they were usually violently anti-American. And you would find that the tempo and his style of speaking would get your attention even if you didn't want to listen to him. He would start out speaking very softly, and then he would build it up until he really got his audience attention. Then they would start shouting slogans back and forth, and then go off and throw stones at the British embassy or the American embassy or some other establishment in town. Sukarno had no interest in economics, and the result was that after 20 years of Sukarno's rule as president, the per capita GDP, this would be in 1965, was lower than it had been in 1938. So the country went backwards, this country with tremendous natural resources. And there was a total failure to develop those resources. Sukarno's rule ended, as you know, in a traumatic coup attempt by communist groups working with some elements in the military who were also leftist-oriented. And an eventual change of government took place. Sukarno was eased out of power over a period of 2 years in a masterful political operation by a general who emerged to the top after 6 of the top generals were killed by the communists. This general was Suharto. He was a fellow that we didn't know in the American embassy. I was there at that time. He was one of the few top generals who had not been trained in this country. We had no contact with him. He didn't speak English. You never saw him on the cocktail party circuit. He was very much a loner, very much of a soldier's soldier. And even close Indonesian associates said they didn't really know him well. But he pulled together the remnants of this shattered military force and set the country on the road to stability and, to our great delight and amazement, the road to economic growth. He brought into power with him a group of American-trained economists called the Berkeley Mafia. They got their PhDs at Berkeley, and they returned to Indonesia in the early 60s. And Suharto picked him up. The professor of finance became the minister of finance, and so forth. And this group ran the economy for about 25 years. They brought the inflation rate down from 600% to single digit. They developed the infrastructure. They increased the per capita GDP from $70, which it had been in 1965, to about $1,200 on the eve of the 1997 financial collapse. So the achievements under Suharto for 20 years or so were indeed remarkable. It was, as Dr. Bird said, and one of the economic miracle countries. Economic growth accelerated. A middle class, estimated about 20 million people, grew up, and that was a great force for stability in one sense, but also for change in another, because this middle class started to push very hard for a more open political system. Suharto diversified the economy. At the outset, it was 70% dependent on revenue from oil. By the mid-'80s, that had been reduced to about 15%. And a whole range of manufacturing and other enterprises had grown up to account for the rest of the GDP. Under Suharto, Indonesia, which had been the world's largest rice importer, became self-sufficient in rice. They used to import 2 million tons. A big hunk of their foreign exchange went to feed themselves. But because of enlightened economic management, the production escalated dramatically and they became self-sufficient. Under Suharto, they had what was undoubtedly the most successful non-coercive family planning program in the world. Suharto, in fact, got a big award from the United Nations for that achievement. And it meant that Indonesia's growth rate was cut from 2.3% to about 1.5, 1.6%. And there were similar achievements in education, in public health, in longevity, in developing the infrastructure and so forth. A remarkable performance. But there's another side to that coin. Suharto also had a number of shortcomings. There were a number of failures in his, what turned out to be 32-year regime. The most serious was that his repressive authoritarian government provided no scope for the development of viable political, social institutions. Political parties were tightly controlled. The press was tightly censored. NGOs, the kind of groups that are so important in this country and are now important in Indonesia, what we call civil governance, did not exist at that time. The result was that the machinery for an orderly political change was not in place. And the result was, as Suharto learned to his sorrow, that the next political change also, the one that ended Suharto's rule, was violent. Suharto also ran things very tightly from Jakarta. Every decision was made in Jakarta. The provinces, the kabupaten, the districts or counties, had virtually no authority. Governors were picked, mayors were picked, county supervisors were all picked from Jakarta. We can now see the results of that there is strong agitation in the outlying areas for more autonomy, more authority, and in some cases for outright independence. Suharto also suppressed what we now see are serious ethnic and religious differences among the various groups in Indonesia. All of the various major religious groups are represented in Indonesia. There are some 300 ethnic groups. Under Suharto, I must admit, I used to say, and it was the conventional wisdom, that Indonesia is a remarkable success of ethnic diversity. But as we can see now, this is not really the case. The tensions were suppressed, but now they're coming out, and we see serious violence in many parts of Indonesia. In Maluku, the old Spice Islands, in Kalimantan, parts of Borneo, you've been reading about headhunting resuming among the Dayaks, and so forth. So the stability that was achieved under Suharto, while it was essential to underpin the economic growth, also came at a significant cost, and Indonesia is paying the price for that now. One of the factors contributing to this ethnic violence, this strong violence among different groups, comes because of Suharto's transmigration policy. Now, he didn't originate it. In fact, it goes way back under the Dutch. But the idea was to move people off of Java. The Indonesian population is not evenly distributed among all these islands. Java, which has 6% of the land area, has 60% of the population. Well, as you can imagine, there's overcrowding, there's economic distress, landless laborers, shortage of jobs, and so forth. So Suharto significantly accelerated this program of moving Javanese off of Java and setting them up in these sparsely populated outer islands. The trouble was, they were plopped down in these islands as self-contained, independent communities, sort of little Javas. They didn't interact with the local people. They didn't integrate into the society in Kalimantan or Sulawesi or Irian Jaya or wherever. And we now see, again, the price that is being paid for that in the serious violence. Suharto also built on what I call the culture of corruption. Now, again, he didn't invent it. It was there under the Dutch. It was there under the Japanese and the first president, Sukarno, but he certainly embellished on it. And his family did even better than he did at it. And of course, if the president engages in corrupt practices and uses his position to further his own economic well-being, everybody else does it. It goes right down through the system. The cabinet ministers do it, the governors do it, and so forth. And that is a major problem in Indonesia today. And as a final shortcoming of the Suharto regime, and this one underlies all of the rest, he politicized the military. His power base was not a political party or any other civilian group. His power base was really the military. And he brought them into politics. He identified them, and they identified themselves as supporters of one of the political parties, the state-supported party called Golkar. And the military, rather than being above politics, became a very important part of politics. One of my Indonesian friends put it somewhat crudely, but I'm afraid accurately, when he says, Suharto did a lot for the country, but he lived too long and his children grew up. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. If he had quit after 15 or 20 years, I think he would have gone down as one of the great statesmen in Asia in the 20th century. But he didn't have the good sense to do that. And you know, so many of these, he isn't the only one, so many of these leaders hang on much too long. He had 6 children. They grew up and they all went into business, capitalizing on their father's position. The poorest of the children is worth probably 200 or 300 million, the wealthiest several billion. And they didn't earn it all on their own ability. So this has been a persistent problem in Indonesia, and one that still needs urgent attention. Well, Suharto bit the dust. The catalyst for that was the 1997 financial collapse, which hit Indonesia much more seriously than it did the other countries in the area. As you know, it was also a major issue in Thailand, a lesser so in Malaysia and the Philippines, and a big issue in Korea. But Indonesia was the one that was the hardest hit, and the one that has been the slowest in recovering. And that was the catalyst that brought together a lot of groups that were having increasing concern about Suharto, about the authoritarian rule, about the corruption, about the lack of orderly change, the lack of orderly outlets, press, television, and so forth. The students took to the streets. Some of Suharto's own cabinet members told him that the time had come, that they could no longer serve with him. And as you know, in May of 1998, he finally did the right thing, and he resigned. Although how much better it would have been if he had done it 10 or 15 years before. He was succeeded by his hand-picked vice president, Habibie, an aeronautical engineer educated in Germany, a man that I say had a constituency of two, his wife and Suharto. And other than that, he had no real power base. And that's probably why he was picked to be vice president by Suharto. He couldn't possibly be a threat, not to Suharto, or to the person that I think Suharto really wanted to get into the president's job eventually, and that's one of his daughters. But he didn't have that chance because things got out of his control. Now, Habibie had the job for 17 months. And I have to say he did a good job. I think in history he'll go down well. There are two problems, and I'll come to those in a minute. But he opened up the society. He opened the press, the political party system. Instead of 3 tightly controlled parties, they ended up with about 150 parties. It finally narrowed down to 7 major parties. Too many, but it's in the process of working itself out. The press is free. Several hundred new newspapers and magazines have appeared. And the whole system, the whole atmosphere in Indonesia is now much more open and much more permissive than it ever was under Suharto. But, and I should say that Habibie, under his regime, under his reign, Indonesia had the best election that it's ever had. In June of 1999, they elected a new parliament. It was a free, open, very successful election. And this gave people a lot of encouragement about the prospects for real democracy in Indonesia. Habibie, obviously, having achieved this record, wanted to continue as president. He declared there should be elections. Let's throw it open. Let's let the people speak. But 2 problems arose before these elections took place. One was a bank scandal, where there was an effort to siphon off $70 billion from a bank into the coffers of Habibie's party. And it didn't work. He got caught at it, and of course this led people to say, well, it's just the Suharto thing all over again. Probably even more seriously was the East Timor problem. Habibie, again, he did the right thing here, but he did it the wrong way. He became annoyed by outside pressure, mostly from Australia, probably to a lesser extent from the US, saying you ought to open up East Timor. You ought to give them an opportunity to determine their own future. So he said, okay, if that's what you want, we'll do it, and we'll do it this year. Now, even East Timorese, even Ramos Horta, one of the top East Timorese independence leaders, said, hey, wait, that's too quick. We ought to phase this over several years. Habibie said, no way. You want it, we're going to do it now. He thought, I'm sure, that they could win. The Indonesian military thought they could win. Well, you know the outcome. They didn't. 78.5% of the East Timorese voted against Indonesia and voted for independence. And again, there was the traumatic, the disastrous after effect of that, when militia groups supported by the Indonesian military, and almost certainly some of the Indonesian military themselves, destroyed much of Dili, the capital city of East Timor, forced a couple 100,000 people to flee as refugees into West Timor, a part of Indonesia, and generally destroyed the effective economy of East Timor. That is a legacy that Indonesia is going to have to live with for a long time. In October of 1999, Indonesia picked a new president. Habibie was no longer a candidate. The president was elected indirectly, and everybody thought that a sure winner was the daughter of the first president, the daughter of Sukarno, a woman named Megawati Sukarno Putri. Sukarno Putri meaning Sukarno's daughter. And she was her party was by far the largest winner in the parliamentary election in June of 1999, winning some 34% of the vote. As I say, by far the largest single party. But Megawati was not a good politician. She sat in sort of regal splendor, waiting for people to come to her, and she would tell them what kind of a deal they would get, but this didn't work. And the result was that Abdurrahman Wahid, whose party had only 11% of the vote in the elections, put together an alliance that outvoted her. So Abdurrahman Wahid became president. He very wisely picked Megawati as his vice president. And so that's the team that we now have. Now, Abdurrahman Wahid, who's colloquially known as Gus Dur, which I guess a liberal translation would be honored elder brother. It's a term of affection in Indonesia. He has several major handicaps. One is his health. He's almost totally blind. He's had 2 strokes, one very serious, and it has to be helped to walk around. But more serious is the fact that he can't read. He's totally dependent on what people whisper in his ear, and I'm afraid he doesn't have very good people whispering to him. He's not getting the full story. And this is a major, major problem. He also, I have to say, as a friend of his, lacks management capabilities. He doesn't focus on issues well. Certainly the first president, he seems to have no real interest in economics. He makes outrageous statements sometimes. For example, about Megawati, who's his vice president, and on whom he is strongly dependent for a majority in the parliament. He said one day, we're the perfect couple, Megawati and I. She can't talk and I can't see. Well, Megawati doesn't talk much. She's a very quiet person. Needless to say, she didn't take too kindly to that. At another point, and this was quoted in the press in this country, he said Megawati is just stupid. Well, that's not a good way to get somebody's support. You may get their attention, but you're not going to get their support. He's a hip shooter, now he has been accused, as you probably have seen in the press, of 2 major scandals. One is the diversion of roughly $4 million in rupiah equivalent from the fund of one of the government agencies, the retirement fund. And the other is a grant, a gift of $2 million from the Sultan of Brunei. Brunei is one of these countries that has no taxes, cradle to grave, social benefits, one of the highest incomes in the world. So the Sultan of Brunei's got a lot of money. He decided to give $2 million to Gus Dur. Gus Dur hasn't said and won't say what happened to the money. And this is a major problem. I cannot believe that he put it in his own pocket or that he's using it for his own personal purposes. I suspect he's run into the same problem that some of our politicians run into, and that is that he needs to bankroll his party for the next election, and that this money was to be the kitty for his party to increase its support in the next election in 2003. But he won't explain that. So the result is the same rumors are flying. Here it is. It's Suharto-type corruption all over again. Well, Indonesia is now at a major crossroads, and there are some key issues that have to be faced that will decide whether this important country survives or does not survive in its present form. Can democracy succeed in Indonesia, or will the country, by force of necessity, return to authoritarianism? Will it become the world's third democracy after India and the third largest democracy, most populous, after India and the United States? Or will it again become a dictatorship? Well, the jury's still out on that. We still don't know. Another question, can Indonesia survive as a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, geographically fragmented nation? Well, we can't be sure. There is ethnic violence. There's religious violence. In Maluku, the old Spice Islands, it's Christians against Muslims because the religious balance changed against the Christians, and these two groups are killing one another. In Kalimantan, in Borneo, it's ethnic group against ethnic group. So there are major problems about the survivability of the country in its present format. Another question underlying all the others, can Indonesia get its economy back on track? As I said, 1997 hit Indonesia harder than anybody else. The rupiah, its currency, depreciated by 70%. Its stock exchange index went down by 50% and has stayed there. You can imagine the effect that that would have in this country or in most other countries. The per capita GDP now is about half what it was in 1997. Now, there are a few encouraging signs. Exports are increasing dramatically because Indonesia's wage rates are very low. I bought a VCR recorder a few weeks ago, Panasonic, got it home, opened it up, made in Indonesia. Well, they weren't doing that when I was ambassador there. This is something fairly new that's happening, that companies are moving in to take advantage of the wage rates. Textiles are booming in Indonesia, being exported here and to Western Europe. Shoes, a lot of the Nike, Reebok shoes are made in Indonesia, and so forth. Inflation is down from 70% to single digit. The rupiah is relatively stable, but it's almost 10,000 rupiah to the dollar, where in 1997 it was 2,500. So again, the whole economy is out of kilter. And there are major questions whether it can be put back together or how it can be put back together. There's a problem of national cohesion. There's a problem of national unity. There are dissident independence movements in several important areas on the periphery. It's very uncertain how these will play out. The basic job, of course, has to be done by Indonesia in solving these problems. But the U.S. can help, and we can help in some very important ways. We can help through economic assistance, through encouraging further assistance from the IMF and the World Bank. We may want to talk about the IMF. Its record in Indonesia, I think, is very spotty. But it has a role to play, and it needs to play this role. We can help also with this area of civil governance. This is an area that we're very good in helping them develop the mechanisms for a functioning democratic system. As I say, they have to design it. They have to do the basic work, but we can help. We can provide moral support more than we have. President Abdul Rahman Wahid visited the U.S. twice visited Washington twice since he's been president. Both times, it was a knockdown, drag out to get him an appointment to see President Clinton. That shouldn't happen. This is the leader of the fourth largest country in the world, a country that is trying to move toward democracy. Eventually, he saw Clinton, but the atmosphere that was created was not very sympathetic. And I think that needs to change and hopefully will change. The stakes are very high. We read about the challenges in this country to the new administration and foreign policy. The Bush administration faces challenges in China, in our relations with Japan, with Russia, Taiwan problems, and so forth. We don't read about a real challenge with Indonesia. We should be reading about that. In fact, the Bush administration needs to focus quickly on Indonesia and find ways to be of assistance, ways that are compatible with Indonesia's own culture and with its own policies. We need to listen more to Indonesia. We need to listen to most countries, for that matter. In the last year or so, we have done a lot of lecturing in Indonesia, telling them what they ought to be doing. It has not gone over well. We've gotten much too deeply involved in telling them what they should be doing, rather than asking them what they want to do and how can we help you. So I'm hoping that there will be a new style in our approach to Indonesia, a new style to our diplomacy. If there isn't, there's a real danger that in the next U.S. election, one of the issues may be who lost Indonesia, who failed to take advantage of the real opportunity to help this country move toward democracy. I think we'll do it, but we haven't bit the bullet on it yet. Well, let's throw it open and see what you'd like to talk about.
Well, we thank you very much for a wonderful overview. It's very helpful. And the floor is now open for questions. The question is, how much of a threat is China really? And why would China want to take on the problem of expansionism toward Indonesia?
The resources, I think, largely. That doesn't mean they're going to necessarily move in and invade, but there are other ways of gaining economic or political dominance in an area. And I think that's what concerns a lot of the people in Southeast Asia. The Indonesians are non-aligned, and they're very proud of that fact. And they want to remain non-aligned, and I think they should remain non-aligned. But I used to say when I was ambassador there that they're really non-aligned on our side. They like the fact that the 7th Fleet is moving around in those waters. Their main concern is that someday it may not be there. They're concerned about, I think unduly concerned about neo-isolationism in this country. They're concerned about budget cuts, less so with the Bush administration than they have in the past, that might curtail some of our military activities in the area. So I think as long as we are active in the area, economically and militarily, they will be largely reassured. But if we aren't, they may want to strike their own deal with China, which is a major power in the region. In addition to security concerns, they're concerned about the effect of China on their own very powerful Chinese minority. You've probably heard that the Chinese are a fairly small group in Indonesia. They're about 4% of the population, but they're estimated to control something around, this is pre-1997 figure, something around 70% of the national wealth. And so this is a very strong, important group. And if China were influencing that group, this would be something that Indonesia would be very concerned about.
How much of the Sure, the coup in
Oh, yeah.
the coup in 1965, and the question is, how involved was the Chinese government in that coup?
I think we'll never know. There are a lot of questions about that. This all took place, as you said, in the wake of the abortive September 30, 1965 coup attempt by the communists with some military supporters, an effort to grab power and to neutralize the main opposition to the communists, that was the Indonesian army. 6 army generals, the top hierarchy of the army, were murdered ruthlessly, some of them in front of their wives and children. And in the wake of that, the Indonesian army, together with what I call the political Muslims, this is those Muslims who use their religion as a part of their political base, took off after the communists, decided it's either us or them, and a lot of communists were killed. Now, the common figure that you read about in the newspapers is 500,000. I think it was much less than that. But again, we'll never know. This all happened in 1965, 66. There's no documentation. But certainly a lot of people were killed. They were not mostly Chinese, because the Indonesian communists were not mostly Chinese. They were mostly ethnic Indonesians. What percent were Chinese? I don't think we'll ever know, but chances are no more than 10% of the several 100,000 that were killed. But the net effect of it was that the Indonesian Communist Party, which was the 3rd largest communist party in the world, right after the Soviet Union and China, was eliminated. And this was one of the major turning points in history, certainly in Southeast Asia, if not in all of Asia, for many, many years.
How powerful is the Muslim influence?
I think it's quite strong. Again, a lot of us have changed our view on that. I used to say, 20 years ago, that Islam was just a veneer on the Indonesians. It was only the last of many waves that have swept over that archipelago. The Buddhists came, the Hindus came, they were finally pushed down to Bali, where they remained. And then the Muslims came, starting in a serious way in about the 14th century. But I think that is an oversimplification. They take their religion seriously. They're Sunni Muslims, which is the more moderate group. They still follow pre-Islamic practices in some respects. Javanese practices. As an example, a lot of the Javanese culture is based on pre-Islamic practices and concepts. You may have heard of the famous Javanese shadow play, the shadow puppets. These are leather puppets which are carved out. You get a shadow. So they show them. You'll get the puppeteer will run the show on this side of a transparent screen, and you can watch it either from this side or that side. The stories are from the Hindu epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. I don't know, you've heard about in Afghanistan, they're destroying images of human beings and so forth. That won't happen in Indonesia, not with these puppets and so forth, or not with their other figures, because these have been absorbed into their own culture. Now, academics, and although I'm teaching, I'm not really one of them, engage in long esoteric discussions about which is the real world. Is it this side where the puppeteer is, or is it the other side where you see the shadow? And this all gets very Javanese. But I have to say, go back to the original point, they take their religion seriously. But they are not in any sense fundamentalists. They think Saddam Hussein is about as bad as we do. In the Gulf War, They provided totally free and open access to us to move through, to fly over Indonesia. Absolutely no problem, because they supported Kuwait. So they are Muslims, but they're not fanatical Muslims. But Islam has an important moral base for them.
Do you have any indication as to how seriously the Bush administration is taking Indonesia?
I don't yet, but I'm encouraged for several reasons. The main one of which is that Paul Wolfowitz has just been sworn in as the #2 in the Pentagon. Now, Paul Wolfowitz, former dean at SAIS, was also a former ambassador to Indonesia. Like me, and like a lot of people, he got hooked on Indonesia. He's fascinated by the country. He's a strong supporter, but realistically so. You know, we all recognize the problems of Indonesia, but we all also, I think, recognize the importance of it. And although the Pentagon should not be in the forefront of setting U.S. policy toward Indonesia, Wolfowitz is one of Bush's top advisors, was one of his top advisors on foreign policy during the campaign. So I'm confident that Paul will put in a word with Colin Powell and with Dick Armitage, who's going to become the #2 in the State Department, and so forth, and that there will be increased attention to Indonesia. But I can't say, since so few of the Bush team are in place now, I can't say that I actually have a feel for their view toward Indonesia. We may know more next week, because the Indonesian foreign minister is coming to town, actually to a conference that we're sponsoring next Wednesday. And it will be interesting to see whether he gets an appointment with Colin Powell. This hasn't been confirmed yet, has it? No. It has been requested. So we'll see. Will Colin Powell see him? I certainly hope so. If he does, what will be the nature of the conversation? And what will Colin Powell say publicly after the meeting? So I think next week we'll have a much better feel for this.
Ambassador Masters, we're grateful to you for taking so much of your time. And I think really providing us with a truly educational evening. It's been splendid. Thank you.